Greetings and welcome back to room 303. We are in freshman English, and we now turn to the question of the big five as it relates to Greek mythology and Greek thought. So write that down. That will be where we began. Let's reframe the question though. What exactly is it that we're asking of ourselves right now? When we look at Greek thought, we've already given lectures as to why that's important. We ask, what is it that the Greeks gave to the West that's so hypercritical? In many ways, the roots, as we said, that grow this tree of Western civilization. Big five. Let's list them and then address them, in order as we'll take them. 1, epistemology. Don't worry about spelling. You can come back to run that down to ground later. Epistemology. Epistos, from the Greek root, meaning knowledge, what it is that we know. Ontology, our second one. Ontology, of or related to the study of being, existence, we might say. We'll come back to each of these. 3, psychology, the study of the individual mind, the motivations that run behind our actions as it relates to that mind. 4, sociology. If psychology is the study of the individual mind, sociology is the study of the group of minds. That is to say, when you put a bunch of people together. In other words, it's fascinating to note, the Greeks pointed this out, people behave differently when they're alone in their bedroom than when they're sitting, for example, at a concert with 50,000 other people. Do you know what I'm saying? You would do stuff at a party, for example, with other people around, you wouldn't do by yourself. What's going on with that? The Greeks had a lot to say about that. Finally, number 5 of our big five, we say theodicy. T-H-E-O-D-I-C-Y. Theo, Greek, coming from the derivative of God. Dike, the Greek, over-related to justice. In other words, it's the question of suffering or evil in the world. Our goal now is to outline each of these and then ask a very simple question. What do our stories that we derive from Greek mythology have to say about each one of these? Some of these we've already kind of gestured towards in earlier lectures. Some of this will be review. Some of this will be brand new information. Let's begin with epistemology. The Greeks, of course, will posit a certain notion of the way the world looks when you look at the world. They posit that, for example, we have gods that sit on Mount Olympus. We have humans who live down below. And there's something fundamentally different about those two things. The gods are immortal, which means they live forever. And they possess epistemological certainty. So let's go to epistemology real quickly. When we talk about epistemology, we see it, as we have said already once before or twice, a continuum. On the one hand, we have absolute epistemological certainty. Knowledge. I am right. If you disagree with me, you are wrong. Epistemological absolute certainty. Okay? The Greeks will point out what becomes abundantly clear through time, that sometimes people with this absolute epistemological certainty, they behave in some very disturbing ways. They fly airplanes into buildings and lots of people die. You hear us? You hear us? Absolutism, as it relates to epistemology, then, can become somewhat questionable. And the Greeks pointed this out. You got to be very careful about saying, I am absolutely right and you are absolutely wrong if you don't agree with me. Which begs the question at the other end, what we will often refer to as the relativist position. Now, what is the relativist position? Well, the relativist position argues knowledge, it's all relative. It's all contingent on your view. What you think is true is what you think is true. And what I think is true is what I think is true. There is no absolute truth. Of course, it was the Greeks who pointed out that the moment you say there is no absolute truth, you've posited a truth. It sounds pretty absolute. This is what we call the performative contradiction. Write it down. Performative contradiction. It argues that relativism folds in on itself. Now, the classic Greek thinker of this ilk is Socrates. So write his name down. We'll come back to him. Socrates. Okay? Well, this begs an obvious question for the Greeks. If you don't want to be an absolutist because you can get yourself in some serious trouble as an absolutist, And clearly the relativist position has its flaws vis-a-vis the performative contradiction. Then what can we do to somehow balance the two? We like to think about the poem, The Odyssey, which we'll be studying together. At one moment in the Odyssey, Odysseus is told by Tiresias in the underworld, as you're sailing back home to Ithaca, you're going to come in between Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla, this terrible monster. Charybdis, this terrible whirlpool. You're going to have to sail between the two, and you're going to lose men. Guys are going to get jacked. You can't go around. Have you ever heard the phrase, between the rock and a hard place? It's where it comes from. In other words, epistemologically, this is the point, you have to kind of skirt between the two. That is to say, a middle ground. And this will be the Greek gift. In many ways, this is the beginnings of Western civilization. Certainly the beginnings of scientific method that will happen a few years later in Europe in 1700. We call it the Enlightenment, scientific revolution, for a reason. This is the fallibilist position. Okay? The fallibilist position. Now what does that mean? Well, it means fallible. I could be wrong. Okay? I could be wrong, epistemologically. Now, if you're speaking, of course, in religious language or moral language, we call this humility. Right? T.S. Eliot will say in East Coker, the only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless. That's a Greek idea. It's a very Greek notion. And the Greeks will argue, epistemologically, it makes a whole lot more sense to practice being a fallibilist than it does to assume that you know everything. Because the minute you start assuming you know everything, usually something happens that ends up with jack. That's the way it works in these poems, in these stories, right? So the fallibilist position says, I think I'm right, I could be wrong. Okay? Pause for a moment in the stories that you've been reading about the Greek gods and think about a moment when a human being has to learn the hard way. The fallibilist position is probably the better way to go than the position of absolutism or relativism. Go ahead, give it a try. Write down something that comes to mind. I'll give you a hint. It may have something to do with a horse and some people inside of it. And a city that couldn't fall. We've heard about those cities before, right? The city that couldn't fall, the civilization that couldn't be defeated. And it invited into its gates a certain wooden horse. Unless you're a Monty Python fan and it's a large wooden badger, we'll get to that. And then under cover of night, the people inside, who of course are Odysseus and the rest of the Greek soldiers, crawl out while those poor Trojans are party-hardying thinking they've won the war. They are absolutely certain the war is over. Stupid, way stupid, right? That is to say, now let's not call it stupid, let's call it epistemologically shallow. They thought they knew, they didn't know. Okay? Epistemology. Let's move to ontology. Ontology. The Greeks were the ones that said, look, this is really fascinating. There's really not one of you. There's actually more than one of you. What? What are you talking about? Well, they said it this way. There is this thing that's physical. We messed around with this already when we studied our Longfellow Psalm of Life, right? There's this thing that's your body. No question, you have this thing that's your body, right? But there's another you. There's this thing called your mind. Although the Greeks even went further, and they said, think about this. You, sitting there right now, you can think a thought. Right? Like, for example, I'll just mess with you. Whatever you do right now, do not think about pink elephants. Don't do it. Don't do it. Really, Mr. McGee? Really? Yeah, but here's something fascinating. The Greeks pointed out, the moment that you thought about pink elephants, because I told you not to, there was something that was standing behind your mind that would allow you to say, oh, I just thought about pink elephants even though I wasn't supposed to. Hold your finger up in front of your face. That is your mind. That is your mind thinking about pink elephants. Put your other finger back behind this, closer to your face, and ask a simple question. If your mind is thinking about pink elephants, even though I told you not to, What is it that's aware that your mind is thinking that? Because it clearly can't be your mind. Because the eyeball can't see itself. That clearly can't be your mind. Your mind is what's thinking about pink elephants. What is it that's aware you're thinking about pink elephants, even though you're not supposed to? What is that? And all of a sudden the Greeks say we go from 1, a body, to 2, a mind, to 3, a soul, spirit. Well, what is that? Oh no, that's really important. Because that's what makes you, you. What do you mean that's what makes me, me? Well, yeah, I mean, think about it. I once had a student named Davis and he loved his dog. We asked this question in class. What's the difference between Davis and his dog? His best friend sitting right next to him said, not much. And we all kind of had a giggle about that. But then we had this conversation about what's really the difference between you and a dog. Write down his name, because he's going to be an important thinker for us. His name is Aristotle. Aristotle argued, I'll tell you the difference between you and your dog. Both of you can look at the sunset. Only one of you can go, wow, that is so unbelievably beautiful. Appreciate it. The Greeks invented a discipline called aesthetics, the appreciation of beauty. And it's, for Aristotle, fundamental to being human. Write it down when we study his great text, Poetics. We'll talk about why it's the case you go to a movie and care about what's going on. You know what I'm saying? It's like, really? Why would you care that somebody's about to die? You even start crying sometimes? Like, dude, they're just actors. It's not like it's real or anything. Aristotle says, I'll tell you why. It's the same reason when you go to a ball game, you get all jacked up. Because, as somebody who I live with says, let me get this straight, grown men run a little ball across a white line and 10,000 people jump up and down. I mean, really? Well, yeah, see, we get caught up. Why? Because that's called being human. Human. See, the Greeks invented a very interesting question. If we're born mammal, are we also born human? Or is human something we become over time through our education, and we choose that? We use the word humane to mean to act in a certain kind of appropriately human way. What does all of that mean? That's the study of ontology. That's the question of who are you? Which is a really funny question. Like, watch this. When did you begin? What do you mean, when did I begin? I began the moment I was born. Really? So you didn't hang upside down in amniotic fluid for all those months, not breathing air. How does that happen? So that wasn't you. No, I guess that was me. So when did you begin? Well, I don't know. I guess I began when 2 people who I didn't choose hooked up and exchanged fluids. That's when you began. The Greeks ask a simple question. Are you sure that's when you began? Because you just said 2 people who you didn't choose got together. That's the only way you're here. That's the only way you're here. What about those 2 people? You might have begun before you started. See, this is all Greeks. You might have begun before you started. In other words, long before you were born, there were 2 people who were born, who were educated, who were given a certain kind of language and lifestyle. Those 2 people got together. On the day of your birth, if I had taken you and set you in downtown Shanghai, China, anybody that you want to talk to about this will say, you'd have been a different you. You'd have been a different... They even say you might have looked different. Because of your nutrition, the air you breathe. Shanghai's bad. Sorry, it just is, right? That is to say, who are you? Where did you come from? Where are you going? Those are important questions. But a fundamental ontological question is, who are you? To try and figure that out, the Greeks invent stories. The Greeks invent stories. And we're going to study those stories specifically in the great epochs, the great epics. That is to say, Achilles. Who is he? Well, is he a warrior? Is he a coward? No. Who are you? The ontological question. Jot down, as you're thinking about the Greek gods, and this notion of who you are. Is there a story that comes to mind for you that best represents that idea in your already reading of Edith Hamilton's mythology? The idea, the question of, who are you? And for example, if you're given the choice, as Odysseus is on the island of Calypso, if you're given the choice to be immortal and live with a drop-dead gorgeous Calypso goddess, dude, that seems like a slam-dunk question, right? But Odysseus says, oh, it's tempting, but no. No, Calypso, she's stunning. She's beautiful. No, I can make you live forever, beautiful, young. No, tell me about this Penelope. Who is this Penelope? Odysseus realizes, you know, if you live forever, death don't matter, and that means life don't matter. Questions of ontology. Number 3. The Greeks, in many ways, invent the study of psychology. Now, hey, these ology just simply means what? Study of, right? So now, psyche, over-related to the mind. More particularly, the individual mind. So write that down. See, the Greeks were onto something here. They said it this way. They said, you act, but what are your motivations for those actions? Like, why do you act the way you act? Okay. And they decide there's different motivations dependent on different things. That is to say, our mind is constructed as not one thing but 3 things. Put it in your notes, the Greeks love their trinities. They're 3s. And the idea is something like this. Your mind is balanced in the same way their word picture is a chariot being driven by horses. You have the chariot, and then you have the horses. And the horses can pull you in one direction or the other. You have 3 of these potential horses that can pull you. The first is reason. Reason. The second is emotion. Emotion. The third is desire. Desire. And what the Greeks say psychologically that's fascinating is that there's always tension between these. You are in middle school. You are outside of Blair's. Your buddy says to you, dude, it's only a pack of gum. Let's go. I don't have any money. Dude, it's only a pack of gum. Let's go. Into the Blair's you go. Analyze what your mind starts to do. Heartbeat. I mean, you've never felt like this before when you walked into Blair's, only you never walked into Blair's going, I wonder if I can take it and get away with it. You start having this dialogue with yourself inside. Your reason, of course, says, this is a really stupid thing to do, you could get caught. Your emotions tell you, you start doing Wally hands, fear, worry. Your desire says, I really like the gum. I really like it. Right? Questions like this. You say to yourself, I better take it, because if I don't, I got to go outside and meet my pals who have already done this, and then I'm not part of the group. Fear pressure. That is to say, how does that work psychologically? Now we're ready to move to number 4, sociology. By the way, these all go together. Sociology. Not what the individual does, but what happens when you get a bunch of people together. The force and influence on a single individual from the group. Now let's get another word here, because the Greeks invented this word as well. The collection was called for the Greeks the polis. P-O-L-I-S. We, of course, today know this word as political. Political. Over-related to the group. Now here, the questions are legion. I mean, we got so many things we got to talk about here. Why is it the case that groups behave the way they behave? And what's up with this thing called leadership? Let's write that one down, it's huge. A good leader. What makes a good leader? And how does a good leader know how to lead? Through fear or manipulation? Through coercion in some ways? Through encouragement? Good leaders understand the way the group works. Of course, there is a dance, and the Greeks love to talk about it this way. Dialectic is their phrase. Tension, dance, between, on the one hand, the individual, and on the other hand, the group. Follow this. On the one hand, leave me alone, I'll do what I want. I don't need you telling me what to do. I'm an individual. On the other hand, Well, the only way I got here, as we said, is two people hooked up, exchanged fluids. I mean, I didn't choose my existence. I didn't choose to be born. So which is more important? The individual, me, and my rights, or the group and what matters to the whole group? The Greeks invented this question. It becomes a phenomenal question for us as we then unfold in terms of our civilizations. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. That is to say, the Declaration of Independence, right? Tom Jefferson's little ditty. That is to say, all of us have these individual rights. And it's because we have these rights that we are of value. But governments, Jefferson will say, are instituted among men to protect those rights. So which is more important, the group or the individual? This is a very typical kind of question for the Greeks. We're going to see this in a lot of our stories as well. Jot down any story that comes to mind for you where that tension is already occurring between the individual versus the group. In other words, I want to go my own way versus I probably need to consider what other people think. What are the stories that for you immediately come to mind that played that game? Should I step out on my own and do my own thing? Or should I follow what the rest of the group is telling me to do? Because that's what's important. That is to say, which is more important, the individual or the group? And what's the dance between the two? Finally, theodicy. Theodicy. Now, there are a lot of ways to describe this one. I'm just going to have you draw a triangle on your paper, okay? And I'm going to ask you for a moment to indulge in a word picture that's one of the famous ones in 303 to explain theodicy, or the theodicic question, as it's sometimes referenced, all right? You go down to Denver Children's Hospital. If you've never been there, you need to go just so you can see true heroes. Children there struggling for the